Welcome back to the channel. You are listening to Sheroy's voice, and this is the One Mic Podcast, episode 8. I was planning on releasing an episode on Monday dealing with the 3-1 victory over Southampton leading into the international break, but I woke up and I saw that a decision had been made in the case between Manchester City and the Premier League. And I was then met with a number of messages and DMs saying, hey man, do you want to cover that? And I thought, why not? It's the international break. Let's introduce a slightly different bit of content for the One Mic Podcast. And I was really driven to do this episode when I saw this bunch of sensationalist tweets and articles with this divide between the red cartel and the blue cartel, and some clubs support the Premier League and others are supporting Manchester City, and there are snitches in the Premier League. And I just saw loads of stuff and loads of reactionary tweets or posts on X, whatever you want to call them. And I just sat there and I thought, yes, there have been a couple of articles published about this, but how many people have actually sat down and gone through the 175-page, well-reasoned decision? And that's what I propose to do with you guys today. So for anyone that thinks I'm boring, I've had a few people kindly leave me some comments on my channel saying that I am quite boring. This episode probably isn't for you. I'm absolutely going to double down on the boring tag today, and I am going to go through this 175-page decision, and I'm not going to do it to bash Manchester City as a football club or make any accusations about them. I'm doing it because ultimately the Premier League rules affect Arsenal. So it's relevant to not just Arsenal fans, not just Manchester City fans, but football fans more generally. And I'm not going to deal with every argument that was put forward. I will sort of summarize at the end what was accepted and what was dismissed. But as I said, there are some important arguments, and I'm going to try and highlight those throughout this. And I have to caveat this by saying, this is not my area of law. I am no expert in this area of law. None of this is to be taken as an expert opinion or legal advice. This is just a football fan reading a publicly available document and trying to make sense of it with his viewers. So let's make sense of this together. You're going to have to bear with me because I have my notes on the right and I have a hard copy 175-page judgment in front of me. So I'm going to try and navigate them both. But look, for us to understand exactly what this case is about, I think it would be useful to go through the factual narrative that led to this arbitration. There's this massive misconception that this was a case that was brought by the Premier League and Manchester City somehow defeated it. I think people are conflating this with the separate matter that's being heard and determined now as to what some people are calling the 115, what others are reporting are actually 130 charges that the Premier League are bringing against Manchester City. But this, I mean, if you look, Manchester City Football Club are the claimant here and the Premier League is the respondent. This is Manchester City's case and this is their claim, all right? Now, paragraph 1, this is actually like a lecture. I'm so sorry for those of you that are already bored, but we are where we are and you're going to have to listen to me fiddling around with these pieces of paper. Paragraph 1, Manchester City Football Club Limited is, as its name suggests, a company whose business is football. In 2008, MCFC was acquired by a company owned by His Highness Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, a member of the royal family of Abu Dhabi. It has since become a most successful football club. Yeah, you can say that again. Just for context, online sources say this about Sheikh Mansour, right? Since the 4th of August 2008, the club has been majority owned by Sheikh Mansour, one of football's wealthiest owners, who has an estimated individual net worth of at least £17 billion and a family fortune of about $1 trillion. Just let that sink in for a minute. Mansour is currently the Vice President and Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, as well as a member of the ruling Al Nahyan family. So for anyone questioning why there needs to be some sort of financial regulation and you can't just let owners do what they want, when you're talking about people that level of wealth and the idea that they could just pump as much resource as they want, this isn't what I would describe the Arsenal owners as, a ridiculously rich owner. This is someone with infinite resource. And that's why there is this regulation, right? Moving on to what the case is about. In this arbitration, paragraph 4, I actually feel like a lecturer, my God. In this arbitration, Manchester City seeks a declaration that rules E55 to 79 of the rules which concern associated party transactions. Those are transactions where any of the sponsors, any of the businesses, any of the subsidiaries that are trying to sponsor or put money into Manchester City have some sort of association, like it says on the tin, with the owners. Rules which concern associated party transactions are unlawful, and an order that 2 decisions of the board concerning such transactions to which Manchester City were a party should be set aside. The grounds of challenge deal with competition law and public law as to procedural fairness. Now, why are associated party transaction rules required? Let me paint a picture for you. Let me explain where these rules come from and why it's even a thing, right? Quite aside from the wealth of the owner that I was just speaking about. Paragraph 13. Following the financial difficulties faced by Portsmouth Football Club in 2009 and 2010, which went into insolvency, the Premier League considered the introduction of financial regulations designed to require clubs to be profitable in order to achieve sustainability by limiting a club's aggregate losses over 3 years. Some clubs expressed concern that related party transactions were a major issue, as they could be used to inflate profits and hence show that a club was profitable even though it was dependent upon them. That is the crux of the matter here, okay? Now, what they had previous rules, which were known as the fair market value rules, right? And there were some concerns about the way in which they were enforced. Those are set out in paragraph 19. And what that says is that a number of representatives of clubs gave evidence that it became apparent that the PSR regime was deficient in policing fair market value transactions. The old PSR regime here, Premier League clubs were saying that they couldn't quite police it, and here's why. The regime relied on clubs essentially making a self-declaration in their annual accounts that a transaction was with a related party. If a club failed to make such a self-declaration, the Premier League had no practical way to determine whether a transaction was in fact an associated party transaction. And crucially, here it says that Manchester City did not make any declarations of associated party transactions under the old regime. So this is basically saying that with the rules as they previously were, if the club itself didn't declare that this was money coming in from an associated party, that was it. There was no means of ascertaining whether that transaction was a fair market value. There was no way for the Premier League or an external regulator or anyone to really exercise the checks and balances required. And to be honest with you, that situation probably would have persisted had it not been for the Saudi Public Investment Fund taking over Newcastle Football Club. Now, this is where it kind of gets interesting in terms of the narrative. Paragraph 20. On the 7th of October 2021, Newcastle United was acquired by an investment group led by the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. On the 12th of October 2001, which is 5 days later, the name is redacted, emailed the Premier League on behalf of his club. We don't know who sent that email or which club that came from, by the way. On behalf of his club and 10 other clubs in the league. In that email, redacted name, requested that notice be given of a vote in 5 days' time, sooner if permitted, to introduce a short-term ban on any related party transactions of any kind. The rules covering related party transactions and new cost control measures, together with any sanctions for breaches, should be formulated by the Premier League legal and financial teams with support from a working group of club CEOs. Whoever wrote this letter and the 10 other clubs that signed up to it saw the wealth that the Saudis also had when they took over Newcastle. And I assume that they've seen the amount of money that the Saudis have plugged into sports like boxing, and they thought, right, associated party transactions here could become even messier than they may have been with Manchester City, for example, and indeed other clubs. We need to have a ban on this until we sort this out. That's where this comes from. All right, so that plants the seed. Moving on to paragraph 32. I told you this was going to be boring, didn't I? Moving on to paragraph 32, you have what any good decision-making process has, right? You have this process of consultation and advice. But this paragraph is interesting because the Premier League took external legal advice and was told that the recommendations regarding the treatment of related party transactions have at least a good prospect of resisting any sustained legal challenge. And within those rules, they had the new proposed fair market value assessment. And what they said here is they observed that the standard of evidently in excess of fair market value should ensure that it's only obviously abusive transactions that are prevented. So this isn't the Premier League saying, look, we want to regulate all transactions, and if we think you've inflated it by 2% and it probably shouldn't be there, we're going to cut you back. This is obviously abusive stuff. We're talking about the more egregious breaches, right? Trying to circumvent the rules that are in place, such as PSR, to try and use associated parties to pump money into your club. And that, as a principle, I don't really see anything wrong with that. And I'm not just talking about Manchester City, and I'm not just talking about Newcastle. I'm talking about Arsenal, and I'm talking about an element. It's never going to be an entirely level playing field, but I'm talking about an element of a level playing field between those at the top and the bottom of the league, and indeed those that are promoted. The Premier League then makes recommendations after this consultation. And this is where some of the journalists and some of the articles said that these particular recommendations were actually of relevance to Arsenal because there were determinations in this decision as to these recommendations. Paragraph 35, recommendation 1 was that related party transactions should continue to be permitted, but subject to a more robust regulatory scheme. However, recommendation 2 was that shareholder loans and equity injections were to be excluded from the definition of a related party transaction, unlike, for example, the rules that are with UEFA. And this is said to continue to encourage investment. I've read that out because it's of relevance to one of the decisions, as I say, and I will analyze it a little bit later. So these are the recommendations. They then take a vote because ultimately, the Premier League does operate on a principle of majority rule. They take a vote. Paragraph 47. On the 14th of December 2021, the shareholders' meeting took place. There was a vote on the proposed amendments to the rules, yada, yada, yada. They were all passed. 18 clubs were in favour, and Manchester City Football Club and Newcastle United voted against. Following the approval of the rule changes by the FA on the same day, the new APT rules came into effect, right? Okay. I'm not making any inferences. I'm not suggesting anything. All I'm saying is note the 2 clubs that voted against. Paragraph 59 then deals with the protocol and the procedure. Most notably, where a club is required to submit a transaction, it must submit any relevant information, evidence, or submissions that the club wishes to be considered by the board as to the fair market value of the transaction. So what this does is it puts the burden upon the club to say, well, this is why it's fair market value. I'm demonstrating, as opposed to putting the burden on the Premier League to determine whether it is or it isn't. The club can make submissions as to whether it is. Fine. That's the background, and that's how we got to where we are. Now, there are 3 notable transactions that Manchester City are complaining about here, okay? So if you do have this judgment open in front of you, and if you have clicked the link, paragraph 73. I keep saying it, but I actually feel like I'm a bloody lecturer. This is not what people usually do on YouTube, is it? Anyway, the First Abu Dhabi Bank. Paragraph 73. In April 2023, Manchester City negotiated a sponsorship agreement with the First Abu Dhabi Bank. The agreement was for, the sum is redacted, perfectly fine, commercial sensitivity, and provided for a total consideration of, again redacted, for that period. On the 20th of April 2023, Manchester City submitted that transaction to the Premier League together with a valuation report, and the Premier League then informed Manchester City on the 2nd of May 2023 that it had determined that the First Abu Dhabi Bank was an associated party and invited any submission to the contrary by the 9th of May 2023. So the Premier League has said, look, the First Abu Dhabi Bank is clearly associated to your ownership. Can you make submissions as to why this isn't an associated party? I find this quite strange. On the 4th of May 2023, Manchester City Football Club said it didn't wish to make any representations on that issue. Why? The case that they brought now is about procedural fairness. The Premier League gave them an opportunity to deal with why that transaction wasn't an associated party transaction or assert why, notwithstanding that, it's a fair market value. But they chose not to exercise that option. That struck me as quite odd. And that's just something that I wanted to know about that transaction. The next transaction, if we move on to paragraph 88, is a transaction concerning the Emirates Palace. The transaction with Emirates Palace was also submitted to the Premier League on the 20th of April 2023. And they tell you what the period of the transaction was, what the total value and everything was. Here's the issue. Although the Premier League issued a final determination that this transaction was evidently above fair market value, so the Premier League said this is actually evidently above fair market value, going back to what I was saying about being an abuse and not just being slightly above. The Premier League then subsequently reconsidered that determination and concluded that it no longer considered the transaction to be evidently not at fair market value. That, to me, is strange on the part of the Premier League. How can you conclude that something is so evidently above fair market value that it constitutes an abuse, which is ultimately what that particular rule was brought in for, and then overturn your own decision? Which is it? And this is why I say that I'm not being tribal about this. There are certain things in here that I've looked at on the part of the Premier League, and I thought you seem to have also got this wrong. This doesn't quite make sense to me. The issue that Manchester City have here, and the reason why it's being brought up, notwithstanding the fact that the decision was reversed, is they say that, paragraph 88 again, the time taken to resolve this question is the subject of a complaint by Manchester City, and so it's necessary to summarise the chronology. So what they're saying is, look, man, you told us that it was above fair market value, so we couldn't get the sponsorship for this period of time. You took ages to determine that, and now you're saying it's okay. Well, we lost out on a fair bit of revenue that could have gone on our books there. That, on the face of it, kind of, I get that argument. That holds weight. The next transaction, the Etihad Aviation Group. Let me get to paragraph 133. Paragraphs 133 to 134. Following calls between the board and the regulatory team, the board was able to reach its decision as to the Etihad Aviation Group. Now, with respect to the total value to be received by Manchester City over this period, the determination was that it was at least, redacted, in excess of fair market value. In its reasons, the board addressed the submissions which had been made by Manchester City and the evidence which they provided. It's apparent that the board and the team worked extremely hard to meet the deadline set by the tribunal for the issue of final determination, and the Premier League referred in their evidence to getting up extremely early to read the reports, giving evidence that members of their team had to work very long hours every weekend and often into the early hours of the morning. This again strikes me as a timing complaint and sort of feeds into what I was saying earlier about the Emirates Palace deal. All of this, the stuff that I've been discussing here, predominantly was April 2023, aside from the last transaction, which I believe was September 2024. Incorrect, April 2024. What's of note is on the 21st of September 2023, if we go to paragraph 139, the Premier League changed the rules. This is what we're calling the amended associated party transaction rules, okay? Paragraph 139, the first of the proposed changes which are relevant in the context of this arbitration concern the removal of could and its substitution by the word would and the insertion of the term normal market conditions in the definition of fair market value. I'm going to read this whole thing out because it's important. So the amended definition of fair market value is this. Fair market value means the amount for which an asset, right, or other subject matter of the transaction would be sold, licensed, or exchanged, as opposed to could be sold. So would, there is an element of this has to be definitive, as opposed to could being like the upper end of what's hypothetical, all right? Paragraph 141, the third relevant change involves shifting the burden of proof. So the burden's on a club submitting that transaction to show it's at fair market value rather than the Premier League to prove that it's not. Now, as to that, I'm not quite sure where I stand on that. Should the burden be on a club, or should it be assumed that the club is operating within the rules unless the Premier League can suggest that it's not? That's a matter that this judgment deals into. Paragraphs 150 and 151, 9th of February 2024, the proposed changes were again the subject of a vote. On this occasion, 12 voted in favour, less than last time, 6, including Manchester City, against, and 2 abstaining. On the 4th of March 2024, the FA approved the rule changes. That's how we got to where we are. Moving on to the headline arguments, the stuff that we've been reading about in the articles and the outcomes. This is where it gets quite interesting. You would have read a lot of stuff about discrimination against Gulf states and things of that nature, all right? And I saw a few Man City fans saying, we've established that the Premier League discriminates against Gulf states. I'd urge you to turn to paragraphs 187 and 188 here, all right? We accept that the acquisition of Newcastle United by an investment group led by the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund was the catalyst for the consultation process leading up to the associated party transaction rules, which led to the setting up on the 21st of October and the imposition of a moratorium on associated party transactions as agreed at the shareholders' meeting. We do not, however, find that the rules were targeted specifically at clubs owned by companies in the Gulf region, but were rather intended to apply to any club that might use associated party transactions. Now, that is an unequivocal rejection of the argument, and they would have heard a lot of evidence about that. And I've highlighted that just to show and illustrate that. I mean, you would have all seen them, right? All the tweets on behalf of the blue cartel suggesting that they won on this discrimination argument, but that would indicate that that's not the case. That would just indicate that it is simply not the case. And that's why it's so important not just to read the bloody tweets and the articles, just go to the source material. Now, this is very interesting. And this is to do with pricing distortion. Paragraph 205. As we understand it, Manchester City makes two submissions. First, it says that subjecting sponsorship rights to a fair market value test is by its nature distortive of competition, since different sponsors may value sponsorship opportunities differently. That sentence there, well, let me read on. Hence, one cannot objectively price the value of a sponsorship agreement. Okay. Secondly, Manchester City submits that the ability of the board to restate a price in an associated party transaction constitutes price fixing. This is a really concerning sentence because it gives you an insight, I think, as to what Manchester City actually wanted out of this. Subjecting sponsorship rights to a fair market value test is by its nature distortive of competition. I mean, I say this with respect. Going back to what I said at the beginning about the potential wealth of certain owners, doesn't there have to be some regulation? If there's no regulation of what might be fair market value, then you're in the Wild West. You're in the Wild West. And insofar as we're not already in the territory where the richest man or woman wins, we'd almost certainly be in that position where there to be no regulation. That for me was a really, really stark thing to read. All right. Now, I mean, and it seems as though the tribunal agreed, because their decision as to that, paragraphs 210 and 211, we accept the evidence that the value of a specific sponsorship deal depends on factors that may be specific to a particular sponsor, and we also know that the Premier League accepted that associated party transactions can have legitimate economic advantages. But for the reasons set out below, we can't accept evidence that the operation of fair market value rules is inherently flawed. And that's what's relied upon by Manchester City in support of its first submission. Whilst it's common ground that the fair market value of such a transaction isn't an exact science, it has to be inherent in PSR that there should be an ability to restate the price of a transaction. Otherwise, PSR would be ineffective. And for what it's worth, I completely agree. That's an essential check and balance here. So that argument was outright rejected. And what I also found interesting, going back to what I was saying about what Manchester City may have wanted out of this, if you turn to paragraph 220, this is what the tribunal says. We would add that despite accepting the principle of PSR, Manchester City Football Club put forward no alternative to the assessment methodology that they sought to challenge. That, to me, is sort of like bringing a knife to a gunfight. I completely understand that Manchester City would probably say, well, it's not our job to come up with the rules. It's your job as the regulator to be coming up with the rules. It's not our job to suggest them. But if you are going to attack them, I think it might make sense to say, well, this is how we think it should operate. But the fact that they couldn't offer up any alternative, to me, is indicative that in actual fact, they didn't want any regulation. But again, that's just my 2 pennies worth, right? Now, paragraph 236. This seems to be a continuing theme. Paragraph 236. In any event, the associated party transaction rules do provide for a review of a fair market value determination by the Premier League board. Manchester City claimed that this doesn't go far enough because, as it puts it in its skeleton argument, it sets a high bar to the challenging club that is expressly not a merits review. This is where I'm talking about the continuing theme. However, Manchester City did not explain why an appeal on the merits and why the review that is provided for in the rules wasn't sufficient. So if you're going to say that the fact that you can ask for a review of a decision isn't sufficient, explain why. Explain why it's not sufficient and pitch an alternative. So, I mean, that sort of knocks back the argument as to sufficiency of review. And what all of this says to me, this is the tribunal saying that prevention is better than cure. And it reminds me of, you know how people moan at airport security, like, why the hell do I need to take my shoes off? Why are all my liquids why do they all have to be under 100 milliliters? Why is this so long? It's because if you don't do that, the damage that is caused by the one that slips through is irreversible and it's irreparable. Prevention is better than cure, which is why this regulation is there, because once that money's in the club, once that money's been spent, once those players have been bought, once those trophies have been won, how do you fix that? You can't put the lid back on Pandora's box, as it were. And that's what I read when I read that element of the competition law challenge. I want to move on to the shareholder loans bit, though, because this is interesting. Moving on to paragraph 245. Just for context, there's been a lot of discussion about this online, right? So let me go through Manchester City's submission, and I'll give you the context. Paragraph 245. Manchester City submits that the exclusion of shareholder loans from the associated party transaction rules is an object restriction. It says that such loans are obviously associated party transactions because they come from a shareholder, and they're obviously not at fair market value because a non-interest-bearing loan or a low-interest-bearing loan or a non-repayable loan is plainly not at fair market value. Such an exclusion is discriminatory, distortive, and or has a differential impact on different clubs. I agree. I absolutely agree with Manchester City there. And let me tell you why. If I want to go to university and I don't come from wealth, I have to take a student loan and pay it back with a ton of interest. What I then have to do to try and pay it back is maybe work part-time whilst I'm at uni and work to pay off my tuition fees. Whereas those that get the cash injection from their parents and they say, pay me back whenever you want, son, daughter, don't worry, it's fine. They don't have to do that. That impacts competition. And that's exactly what Manchester City are arguing here. I completely agree with that submission. And ultimately, I'll get onto it, but the tribunal did as well. And that does have an element of bearing on Arsenal. But as I say, I'll come on to that later. Paragraph 287, do you remember I was talking about substitution of would and could when it comes to fair market value? Let me get to paragraph 287. This is interesting. We also have a concern about the concept of normal market conditions, as explained in the guidance, which states that this means typically a case in which revenues bear a reasonable relationship to any costs. While this might be a suitable test to assess the fair market value of industrial products, which have an easily identifiable cost of production, like milk, such an approach is more difficult in the case of a sponsorship arrangement. A particular sponsorship agreement is often bespoke to the particular relationship between the sponsor and the club. I kind of get that too. And using the example of the Saudis with boxing, for example, now they're putting in a hell of a lot of money. But they've been quite candid about the reasons why they're doing it. They're putting in money that's over and above anything that we've ever seen in boxing, and they're probably not making that money back immediately, right? So people might think, well, commercially, that's over and above what people would typically describe as fair market value, but they're doing so because that particular avenue holds real importance to them. So for that particular funder, it holds a different level of importance than it would for others. And the Saudis are doing it because, as they've said, they want to expand sport in their nation. They want to expand sport and investment from the West. They want to ensure that their country is perceived as slightly more open than it may have been in the past. And they have all sorts of other reasons for doing so. This is an example of how maybe Manchester City's argument in that sense does hold weight. Maybe certain sponsors do have different reasons. The difference between the boxing analogy that I use and this footballing analogy is the Saudis are putting money into the sport of boxing, but they don't own a particular fighter. They haven't really got a horse in the race in that sense. Whereas here we're talking about associated party transactions between a club that is owned by the person who's putting the money in and how that impacts competition. And that's why it's slightly different, right? What I do want to discuss, paragraphs 354 to 355, you know all this chat about multi-club models and how certain clubs that own other clubs might be able to get a really wicked player at a cut price. This is quite interesting. 354 to 355. Here it's argued by Manchester City that the associated party transaction rules have the potential to distort competition by interfering with multi-club entities' ability to compete with non-multi-club entities and directly restricting the abilities of clubs with larger networks of associated parties to compete with clubs without such networks. This is said to be because multi-club entities, crucially, can utilize player development opportunities by transferring or loaning players amongst affiliated clubs, whilst increasing their club's operational flexibility in terms of squad management. What the tribunal, this is interesting though, isn't it? Because let's say that one of the clubs that Manchester City's owners also own as the equivalent to, I don't know, let's say it's Savinho, for argument's sake, a really good player, and they can bring them in. Who's to suggest that that's at the price that that person would have been bought had they gone to an Arsenal? I'm not suggesting that there was anything untoward, but it's an interesting principle. And I think it's something that will come to the fore more and more as these ownership structures become more common. What the decision here says is that we've seen no evidence of actual or potential anti-competitive effect, let alone an appreciable effect on multi-club entities. Further, any transfer of a player within a multi-club entity is not frozen pending a fair market value assessment. Now, is there an argument that a transfer of a player in that situation should actually be frozen pending a fair market value assessment? That is something that I think is going to develop. And I think that the more that we see slightly more suspect transactions taking place, the more that might come to the fore. I'm going to move on to the procedural fairness argument now, because that is something that Manchester City were ultimately successful on. And to that end, I also agree with them. They did a lot right here. Not quite as much right as certain people on X would have you believe, but they did a lot right here. Where am I going? Paragraph 399 to 400. Okay. This basically says that the protocol that the Premier League has doesn't permit a club to have access to a particular data bank before the board makes its assessment as to whether a transaction is at fair market value. And once there is a dispute as to whether a transaction is at fair market value, so once the Premier League says this isn't fair market value, the rules only permit disclosure to the club as opposed to its advisors in exceptional circumstances. Now, for me, if I need to demonstrate what is fair market value, wouldn't it be useful for me to see what the bloody comparators are? It's like if I'm selling my car, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to go on Auto Trader and I'm going to look at what other cars of a similar ilk are going for, and I'm going to price mine appropriately to demonstrate that it's at fair market value. That, to me, is a bit of a no-brainer, to be honest with you. I mean, I understand the commercial sensitivity around it, but the tribunal agrees. The tribunal considers that those rules are procedurally unfair for the reasons given above. And I get that. It's on one hand, the Premier League can't say your transaction isn't at fair market value, and also say, by the way, the comparative assessment that we're conducting and the other metrics, that you can't see for you to be able to demonstrate that it is at fair market value. Now, the reason that I think this was actually a bit of a tap-in is at 407. However, the Premier League and Premier League clubs have agreed that, subject to confidentiality requirements, the comparable transaction and the data bank may be disclosed where there is a challenge to an assessment without harming confidentiality. So it seems as though the vast majority of Premier League clubs agreed with this, and it seems as though the principle is something that the Premier League agreed with themselves. So it's a bit of a tap-in. It's being hailed as this massive win. But it was relatively straightforward. Now, if the conclusions are interesting. They make for interesting reading. Paragraph 592 to 602. Excuse me, I'm a bit old school. I like reading judgments in hard copy. Overall conclusions. I'm going to put this up on the screen as well so you can see it with me. It was just, as you can see, I've cited so many paragraphs, I couldn't do it for all the ones that I cited. Manchester City challenges the associated party transaction rules and the amended associated party transaction rules as being restrictive of competition in several respects. We hold, 1, the exclusion of shareholder loans from the APT rules, and 2, the pricing changes are unlawful because they infringe prohibitions, but all other challenges fail. They also challenge the rules as being procedurally unfair. In several respects, we hold that Manchester City's inability to comment upon the comparable transaction data, what we were just discussing, relied upon by the Premier League before they determine whether it's at fair market value, is procedurally unfair, but all other challenges fail. Now, what you can hopefully see on the screen at this point is 1, failed at 594. 595, failed. Same in a couple of respects. 596, failed. 597, failed. 598, failed. 599, upheld. 600, failed. 601, upheld, but that's only what? Dealing with an unreasonable delay of about 3 months. Hardly bloody groundbreaking, is it? And 602, upheld on the basis of a delay of 2 months. Now, everyone's asking, what does this mean? Because if you were to believe what you read in the news, and if you were to believe what you read on X, Manchester City have spanked the Premier League and Arsenal are going under. In short, associated party transaction rules and fair market value, they still require the Premier League to be satisfied that these transactions are taking place at fair market value. There's just going to be a slightly different procedure for determining so. And if the Premier League does demonstrate an unreasonable delay, this sets a precedent for them to be called out upon it. I think it was a journalist in the Times saying that Manchester City are going to see compensatory damages and costs. Now, again, this isn't legal advice. This is just my opinion. To the extent that you mount a load of arguments and you only succeed on a handful, I don't know if it's particularly likely that you're going to get all of your legal costs and you're going to obtain costs from the Premier League. I think the Premier League will be well within its rights to say, well, with respect, we had to defend God knows how many challenges that were ultimately deemed to not hold merit, so we should get our costs of having to defend those. And they offset the two. So again, this is where journalism is ever so slightly inaccurate. But what's really interesting, all this stuff about the clubs that snitched, who the witnesses for Manchester City were and who the witnesses for the Premier League were. Now, witness statements put in by the claimant, Manchester City, Newcastle United Football Club. Written statements put in by the respondent, the Premier League. West Ham, Manchester United, Liverpool Football Club, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and Arsenal Football Club. Now, one thing that I would note, when people talk about Liverpool, when people talk about Tottenham, when people talk about Arsenal, when people talk about Manchester United, you're talking about, perhaps with the exclusion of Tottenham, you're talking about some of the biggest clubs in the United Kingdom and the world, clubs that are praised for having particular heritage. Now, including Tottenham, you're talking about clubs that are ultimately deemed to be well-run and responsibly run. I'm not talking from the fans' perspective, because I know that Manchester United and Tottenham have gripes with their owners, but when it comes to the way in which the business is run, they're very often well-regarded clubs. Those were the clubs that put in evidence. And it also, look, it says written evidence put in by the Premier League, but it doesn't say written evidence put in by the Premier League in support of the Premier League's case and intended to decimate Manchester City Football Club. People are drawing that nexus and making that jump and calling these clubs sort of cooperators. That's not necessarily what it is. Arsenal Football Club could have basically put in a statement, for example, I haven't seen it, but they could have put in a statement saying, these are our associated parties, this is how we deal with the transactions, and this is our experience of it with the Premier League. Done. There's nothing untoward there. These witness statements are designed to just put forward statements of fact. It's relatively uncontroversial in that respect, all right? And then what you see is club statements from Manchester City saying the club has succeeded with its claim. Now, I just went through all of the failed points that were taken. With respect, that's a slightly sort of sneakily drafted club statement, but I'm not criticizing it. If I was their comms officer, I would have done the bloody same thing. But when you look at the judgment and when you look at the source material, that does not tell the whole story. The Premier League statement for me is actually more accurate. What the Premier League statement says is the tribunal did, however, identify a small number of discrete elements of the rules which do not in their current form comply with competition and public law requirements. More information below. Here's the crucial bit. These elements can quickly and effectively be remedied by the league and clubs. Isn't that the function of a democratic society? Like, people make a mistake in terms of regulation. It gets called out through litigation, through arbitration, whatever you want to call it. An independent decision maker says that's wrong, you need to fix it. The Premier League has now said we're going to go back to the league, we're going to go back to the clubs, and we're going to fix it. Cool, that's how you get to a better system. I think that statement from the Premier League, in my sort of layperson's reading, is perfectly fair. But today there was a further development. The Times reported today that the parties, i.e. Manchester City and the Premier League, have requested further clarification as to what it means for the rules, because City are trying to progress a bumper sponsorship deal with Etihad. People are inferring from that because certain elements of the procedure were deemed to be unlawful or procedurally unfair, City may be seeking to circumvent that by saying, well, no, the rules don't apply. In this interim period, there are no rules, so we're going to try and speed up this bumper sponsorship from Etihad. Now, that can't run. And for me, you want to talk about winners and losers? Football is the biggest loser here, because this is a bloody mess. No matter what the outcome, I don't think many people are going to sit there and bother reading through the judgment the way that I just have and the way that you just have with me. It's going to mar the perception of the Premier League. It's going to mar the perception of clubs. It's going to mar the perception of competition. This is exactly what you don't need, particularly as messy as it's getting now. Having to go back to the tribunal and request clarification. I think the Times also reported that the Premier League and City were sort of corresponding with other clubs as to this and sort of trying to advance their position. It can't run. It cannot run, and it will have a detrimental impact on the brand. Anyway, that brings to a close my assessment of that decision. People are going to ask, what do you think the bearing is on the separate matter of the 115/130? I can see a world within which Manchester City argue, look, you're bringing these charges on the basis of rules that have been enforced. Well, only a matter of weeks ago, certain elements of your rules were found to be defective, found to be procedurally unfair, found to breach public law requirements. Who's to say that we should give your rules any credence? Who's to say that this rule isn't unfair? Or that I think that this decision could be used to muddy the waters. And we'll see if that panel sees through that. But I think it could potentially paint a useful picture for Manchester City going into that case. And what do I think the outcome is going to be of that case? Look, I'm again, it's not my area. I haven't seen the papers. I have no idea. I'm just as clued up about this as you are. But I do remember reading an article that the UAE received phone calls and maybe not phone calls, but certainly corresponded with the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office about this matter. When you have that level of government, politics, international relations at play, it does lead me to believe that the decision may not be as scathing on the part of Manchester City as some people think. But hey, that might just be me being cynical. That brings to a close what is arguably one of the most boring and monotonous episodes that you're ever going to see on YouTube. But quite frankly, I enjoyed it because I'm a nerd. Bit more fun. Wrong answers only. One of my favorite segments. Wrong answers only. Last week, the question was, which non-football related celebrity would be the best choice for Manchester United's next manager, and why? I have to say, like this, the answers for this were probably some of my favorites, right? And I'm going to read out a handful. There was one winner. Jide Akin, Jideakin. I'd say Ronald McDonald, but he seems to already be there. He's just not wearing his red wig. Cold. Sunny Singh, SY5JB, says, this is for those that are tuned into UK politics, says Liz Truss. Because just when you think it couldn't get any more deluded or any worse, I have to say I agree. But this week's winner, Rick Lee 7732. This was cold. The Archbishop of Canterbury, because only God can raise that club from the dead. Ouch. Winner, unanimous, knockout, not going to the judges. This week's question. Let's stick with the theme. I'm thinking of this one on the cuff, the one thing I forgot to prepare. This week's question, wrong answers only. What will happen to Manchester City Football Club after the 115 charges are decided upon? That is what will happen to Manchester City Football Club after the 115 charges are decided upon. You've been listening to Sheroy's Voice. That brings to a close the One Mic Podcast, episode 8. I will be back next week. Thank you to all who have liked. Thank you to all who have commented. Thank you to all who have subscribed. I am well on the road to 5,000 subscribers. If all goes well, hopefully we can hit that benchmark at the turn of the year. And when I get to the 5,000 mark, I am going to introduce a new piece of content. Thank you to all those who have helped me so far. And for those who haven't, please do continue to do so. Until next time.